There are a couple of newer sort of intellectual movements or religious movements, if you will, or kind of straddling the line between the two that came up in the context of studying these heroes and heroic ages. Because the heroes tend to be partly religious, partly significance for the cultural background, there's a possibility of essentially becoming a hero by your sheer will, if you want, kind of becoming a person who becomes an intellectual beacon of some sort. And Denis Diderot, the first writer to ever compile an encyclopedia in the middle of the 18th century, identified a movement that he called eclecticism. And you may have heard this term in modern parlance. The word eclectic is remaining today, albeit in a slightly different fashion. Diderot said the eclectic is a philosopher who, treading underfoot prejudice, tradition, age, universal agreement, authority, in short, everything that subjugates the mass of minds, dares to think for himself, to go back to the clearest general principles, to examine them, discuss them, and admit nothing except on the testimony of his experience and reason, and from all the philosophies which he has analyzed, without deference or partiality, creates an individual and private philosophy which is his own. And creating an individual or private philosophy in this context is a rather important concept because so far the idea of following a religious movement has been following a pre-established tradition, maybe a tradition that already belongs to a certain group, but there is the possibility, very realistically, by the 18th century to create a kind of a hodgepodge of intellectual movements and essentially become your own hero for that group. And in that context, the person who is marked as eclectic is able to kind of show the way to establish this measure of courage, if you will, by breaking the rules that are established about intellectual life and creating their own. A similar fashion exists in religious studies that is called syncretism. Religious syncretism is the mixing of two or more religious belief systems into a new one, something that traditional religious systems tend to disagree with pretty strongly. And Diderot points out that eclecticism must not be confused with syncretism. The syncretist is a true sectarian. He has enrolled beneath banners from which he hardly dares stray. He has a leader whose name he bears. He might be, for example, Plato or Aristotle, Descartes or Newton, no matter. The only freedom he reserves to himself is to modify the opinions of his master, to restrict or expand the ideas that he has received from him, to borrow others from elsewhere, to prop up the system when it threatens to ruin. If you imagine a poor, insolent individual who, unhappy with the rags that cover him, falls upon the best-read passers-by, ripping off the cloak of one, the overcoat of another, makes from these remnants a bizarre mixture of every color and piece, you will have a fairly precise symbol of the syncretist. And Diderot, being a religious man himself, did not really like the whole idea of being a syncretist. Syncretism. Some people tend to assume that syncretism starts with the island of Crete, off of the coast of Greece. Ulysses, for example, sails to Crete. I think we mentioned that during the lecture. This may or may not be true, depending on who you ask in this context. But Crete would have had this kind of privileged position of being in touch with the Greek traditions, while at the same time being in touch with other Mediterranean traditions as well, creating um, their own way to think, their own way to believe. Crete is also where the Minotaur is locked up in the maze. The Minotaur, which is a mix of a human and an animal, and of course the subject of the week is tricksters and cultural heroes, and perhaps the Minotaur could have been some kind of a hero for the people of Crete, at least until he was defeated in battle. Um, so, speaking of battles and speaking of defeat, perhaps question mark, the figures that can be born out of a mixture of religion systems and maybe a mixture of points of references, as we have pointed out on Wednesday, of the interpretation of the Romans and the Greeks that are substituting their deity for the deities of others, we have a pretty good example of how kind of epic poetry has always functioned by mixing messages and points of references, kind of building up the character of some of the greatest heroes and turning them into somebody else's heroes, which is a very efficient way to turn these kind of local legends into a bona fide hero, into a person whose achievements are shining a beacon upon all of us. And there are some pretty well-known examples of that right here in the United States. For example, here, this article dedicated to Cincinnatus, or as you pointed out here, you have often heard him compared to Cincinnatus. The French traveler Jacques-Pierre Biscot de Voirville wrote after visiting George Washington at Mount Vernon in 1788. The comparison is doubtless just. The celebrated general is nothing more at present than a good farmer constantly occupied in the care of his farm and the improvement of cultivation. Cincinnatus is a Latin Roman legend living in retirement in a farm outside of Rome, and kind of had to take up arms because of an emergency of an invasion coming through. So Cincinnatus abandoned his toiling in the fields and abandoned his family and went to war to defeat Rome's enemies. Once he was done defeating the bad guys, he came back to his plow and came back to doing the thing that he always did. He showed courage and became kind of this hero for ancient Rome. And apparently, George Washington had somewhat of a similar situation, or a similar, at least, reputation, to the extent that he was just a regular guy-ish, I suppose, kind of a noble person, but became a war leader for the purpose of the American Revolution, and then went back to anonymity and to becoming a regular person once more, which earned him that title of Cincinnatus. This is from the website of Mount Vernon, so the Washington Library. So the again, we're putting together a ancient legend with a modern legend, and comparing the two together to create this person who is bigger than life, as a founding father, as the first U.S. president, as a war leader, the quote unquote father of the country, eventually becoming a very very complex character in the history of the United States, with, of course, holidays and monuments and everything that is typically associated with the Greek heroes. These monuments, though, are very interesting in the context of the depictions that we have of George Washington and other heroes. These two statues here showing two versions of Cincinnatus in the way. On the right is the traditional Roman Cincinnatus holding, if you are paying attention, a fascia, which is the symbol of fascism, at least as far as Mussolini adopted it. Of course, it was not always a symbol of fascism, but it became one. And in this context, of course, the mythology of Rome was an important resource for fascists. On the left, a Minuteman, kind of again a figure, or a symbol of the American Revolution, appears on the license plates, appears on coins, etc. The Minuteman has a poem written on the pedestal. Here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard round the world. The Minutemen in Ohio apparently giving up their agricultural lifestyle to defend the country. The this idea here, which I'm sure you can connect to movies that you have seen, or other perhaps important figures that you have heard of as heroes, is something that is directly inspired from an old story. And you might start to think at this point how much of that is in fact the result of the essentially somebody living their life having a regular life until adversity strikes, until catastrophe strikes, until something happens that requires them to make a decision. And in a way, this is a very common trope for a lot of stories, especially now that we have a pre-existing category of superheroes. For example, this guy right here who has a secret identity. Once he puts sunglasses and puts his hair to the side, no one can recognize him. He's just this ordinary person who has a regular day job and does just what dudes do until Judy calls, until he puts on his special armor, becomes a superhero for our salvation, brings us our saving, our victory, and sometimes unknowingly to us. Superheroes, by the fact that they have their secret identity, kind of exemplify very clearly this idea of Cincinnatus, of people living regular lives until called upon. And the U.S. Army kind of advertises on this too, especially when you have a certain term of engagement for to be part of the armed forces. So the interest here in myth and the building up of characters as heroes is important, because we are taking the grander stories of people that have been through trouble before and transposing them into our lives, because we are going through similar troubles and we seek an answer for that in the past, or in a similar situation perhaps. Maybe seen as somewhat of a contemporary in a way. And Ernst Cassirer especially pointed out that the idea of the myth here has to be understood as part of this cause and effect that is always happening. That the myth doesn't just come out of nowhere, but rather becomes part of the normal regular thinking of every people who has this symbolic mode of relationship in a state. So Cassirer says mythical thinking is by no means lacking in the general category of cause and effect. Indeed, in a certain sense, they belong to its basic inventory. This is evidenced not only by the mythical cosmogonies, so the world into being, the world coming into being, and theogonies, the gods coming into being, that seek to explain the emergence of the world and the birth of the gods, but also by a wealth of mythical fables, Märchen, so tales, German tales. Kessler was German, that possess a wholly explicative character in that they seek to provide a particular explanation for the origin of some concrete individual thing, such as the origin of the sun or the moon, or the human, or the genus of the animal or plant. The cultural fables, again Märchen, that trace the possession of cultural heritage, go back to an individual hero or savior, Heilbringer, belong to this circle of intuition. So the circle of intuition here, it is important because we can guess on these so many things about the birth of the sun, the moon, and the stars of the universe. There's only so much that we can really discover for ourselves, and having a point of reference in this context, however mythical it might be, or somewhere around the domain of the myth it might be, the hero is allowing us to mediate between the things we know and the things we don't know, as we have mentioned before. So they serve an important role because without them, we have no access to the things we do not know. We are kind of lost without a guide into the unknown. Having a guide, having a legitimate true hero to help us into our existences, is a very important function of pretty much anyone who has ever experienced some form of trouble, to the point that these stories that seem to echo one another must not be some kind of coincidence. We have mentioned before earlier in the semester Edward Fraser, who had this idea of the Rex Nemorensis, the king who is living by the side of the lake and whose mission is to be defeated, and whoever defeats that king has the inherits the throne. Joseph Campbell, whom we have also mentioned before, has brought a similar idea in a mythological study um, of uh, of of a series of myths. Sorry, a series of myths that are from all across the world, representing somewhat of a similar trajectory for the hero themselves. And we'll get back to that a little bit more next week because uh, uh, Campbell delves a lot into psychology and especially into Freud and Jung, stuff that we have little time to talk about right now. But he also points out, especially the role of the hero. Again, the book is entitled "The Hero with a Thousand Faces" because the hero itself appears in a variety of ways according to the variety of people. So Campbell says the hero, therefore, is the man or woman who has been able to battle past his personal and local historical limitations to the generally valid, normally human forms, such a one's visions, ideas, inspirations come pristine from the primary springs of human life and thought. Hence, they are eloquent not of the present disintegrating society and psyche, but of the unquenched source through which society is reborn. The hero has died as a modern man, but as a personal man, perfected, unspecific, universal man, sorry, eternal man, perfected and specific and universal man, he has been reborn. His second solemn task, indeed, therefore, is to return then to us, transfigured, and teach the lesson he has learned of life renewed. So the hero, by navigating from the common world to the supernatural world, to the world of awe of things that we cannot touch, is changed and shows us how victory can be achieved by just daring, essentially by daring to go into some kind of intellectual territory, perhaps, or some kind of physical territory, perhaps, if they're going to battle. And certainly, so the reference to Madame Blavatsky from a couple of days ago, using Satan as a cultural hero, as the kind of the forbidden hero, the hero that we cannot or ought not to touch, but at the same time, the one that shows us the things that are possible when we only have a limited amount of mythology to deal with, or of acceptable forms of mythology, is important to bring in this multiplicity of myths into a single character. And again, Campbell tells us that mythology has been interpreted by the modern intellect as a primitive, fumbling effort to explain the world of nature, that is in Edward Fraser, as a production of poetical fantasy from prehistoric times, misunderstood by succeeding ages in Mueller, as a repository of allegorical instruction to shape the individual to his group, that's in Durkheim, as a group dream, symptomatic or archetypical urges within the depth of the human psyche, that's in Carl Jung, as the traditional vehicle for man's profoundest metaphysical insight, that is Kumaraswamy, and as God's revelation to his children according to the church. Mythology is all of these. The various judgments are determined by the viewpoints of the judges. The for the scrutinized in terms not of what it is, but of how it functioned, how it has served mankind in the past, how it may serve today. Mythology shows itself to be as amenable as life itself to the obsessions and requirements of the individual, the race, and the age. So mythology is important, especially putting mythology into context the way that Campbell does in a very, well, eclectic way, for lack of a better term, by bringing all these traditions into a kind of a single story or story structure. Again, we'll see that next week. Is really putting us into the meaning of existence, and essentially what is so similar to everyone that you see, and perhaps what is slightly different from all the people that you see. The things that we have in common, the very, again, existential strife that we are going through, versus the more kind of fanciful issues that we can meet, stuff that is in the end very easily defeated, that do not require a hero, but only the particular application of particular forces.